Thank you so much for including our paper as part of the conference. This is work with Sharat Ganapati and Oren Ziff on Entrepôt hubs, scale, and trade costs. So generally, when we think about international trade, we think about it as a bilateral arrangement between an exporter as well as an importer. But realistically, there are shipping, transshipping, distribution, and these are logistical activities that involve multiple agents in additional countries. There are lots to unpack here, so we're going to focus on one aspect, that the fact that these logistical activities are concentrated at entrepôts. And what are entrepôts? These are trading hubs where goods are going to travel through. So they don't originate these goods, and they're not the destination for these goods. So why is this important? Well, changes at these hub countries can then affect seemingly unrelated trade costs if goods are routed through them. So we've seen throughout the policy-making world that entrepôts are integral to the trade network and is part of the impetus for national policies that are aiming at engines of growth, as they're trying to either become entrepôt in the case of India, trying to compete with Sri Lanka, or maintaining their entrepôt status in the case of Singapore. So in this paper, we're going to study the entrepôts, the trade networks they form, and how they impact international trade. What I'm going to do is I'm going to describe to you the trade network that is centered around entrepôts under scale economies. I'm going to measure how the global shipping trade network matters for trade flows, and I'm going to evaluate the importance of transportation versus other trade costs on welfare. So what we do first is we establish a number of empirical evidence on how goods are shipped through the trade network. We do this by merging two data sets, one, a customs data set that called bills of lading, and we merge that, which is at the shipment level, to the ships that are transporting these goods, which is the port of call ship data. This allows us to trace a shipment's journey from its origin all the way to its destination. And we're going to observe indirect trade. So these are shipment journeys that make stops with the shipment either on board or transship at additional third parties. I'm Malaysian. I like to use Malaysia as an example. So let's say origin Malaysia, destination US. So these goods from Malaysia to the US could either stop in Singapore and Korea before getting to the US, or the goods from Malaysia gets put onto a different ship, so this is that transship part, in Singapore before it goes to the US. So compared to previous work that have only just observed origin destination trade, or just the ship movements where you only see these stops the ships are making, but not able to tie the origin of these shipments to the destination. So we think that our data is making a contribution here because we're actually able to see the shipment level journey. So we find that the trade network is actually a hub and spoke system. 80% of trade is actually shipped indirectly, and nearly all of this indirect shipment is funneled through entrepôts. And this is a substantial deviation from direct ocean routes, which we will show you later. So then we estimate trade costs that rationalize what we observe in the data, this observed direct and indirect trade through the network. We do this by building a general equilibrium model of trade, allowing for optimal shipping routes and hubs to emerge. And we do this by embedding a route selection model in a generalized Ricardian setting. We find the presence of scale economies that informs what we're seeing in the data. So we develop a geography-based IV to estimate the scale elasticity. We find a 1% increase in traffic on a given leg reduces trade costs by 0.06%. We also established the validity of our modeling approach by finding a tight match between our estimates and the external data. Lastly, we take our estimates and we quantify the trade and welfare impact of the trade network. So we do this by looking at country level transport versus non-transport improvement, Brexit, as well as the opening of the Arctic passage. We find that entrepôts are pivotal to the trade network. They have 10 times the global welfare impact from transport improvement relative to non-entrepôts, with scale amplifying the benefits concentration. And in terms of Brexit, we find that when we account for this interaction of scale and network, smaller countries like Ireland and Iceland that use the UK as an entrepôt are disproportionately hurt. And I'm going to skip the Arctic passage in order to give a little bit more time to my last counterfactual. So we do a couple of things to set up our counterfactuals, but the first one that I'm going to focus on is this country level transport versus non-transport. So for each targeted country, we're going to decrease transport costs by 1%, called infrastructure improvement, versus non-transport costs. You can call this some sort of tariff liberalization. We have 136 countries, 4 cases, so 544 counterfactuals. And so this is going to be our targeted country. And we're going to say, if we make this targeted country easier to transport to or easier to trade with, how does that affect global welfare? And we're going to calculate global welfare excluding the country's own. And this is the figure I'd like you to take away. We find that the largest world welfare impacts come from countries like Egypt, Singapore, the UK, the Netherlands. And so these are relatively small countries, but transportation improvement at these countries are going to generate the largest world welfare improvements minus their own, right? And this is going to harken back to what happened earlier last year when the Suez Canal was blocked and there was a bunch of ship pileups. And this is indicative of how important the Suez Canal is as part of the trading network. We also don't see Panama here in the top 20, and we find that that's because it's important for US trade networks, but less so as part of the global trade network. And so I think with that, I'm out of time, but I'm very happy to continue on if you think I have some time left.
Does anyone have any questions at this stage? If you do, please feel free to jump in. Yes, Callum.
Hi, I was interested also from you present this as a world welfare perspective, so it would imply that there is to some extent an externality perhaps from improving transport infrastructure in these highest placed countries, but at the same time presumably there are bilateral trade-offs as well. So in the Brexit UK case, certainly some EU countries would think that there would be a disadvantage to improving the UK's sort of entrepôt position because of its own, for somewhat protectionist reasons. So I wonder how you feel about this, given this, about the implication of a positive externality being something that could plausibly be pursued on an international level if the gains are international, given the fact that it will always inherently involve trade-offs within between countries, and that these global welfare benefits will not be evenly distributed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to answer your question in 2 ways. One is that I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we do in terms of our Brexit counterfactual, and then I'll talk to you about kind of spillovers. We actually do that by ranking each of the countries and its distance to its neighbors and kind of showing how that spillover works. So first, Brexit. What we do is, we increase the trade costs, so not the transport costs of doing business with the UK. And so we show this a couple different ways. First is, let's say if we don't take into account the network. So it's just going to be a direct cost of doing business with the UK. And so here, that's going to be the dark gray bars here. So here we have ranked the top UK trading partners. And so from the left to the right. So of course, with the naive kind of just direct effects, you see that the UK is hurt. You see Ireland over here is also hurt quite a bit, and that makes sense because Ireland trades a lot with the UK. But to the extent that Ireland uses the UK as an entrepôt to export to the US, that's not going to be affected in that gray bar. That's going to be affected when we allow for the networks and the scales. So that's going to be the light gray bar here. And so when we allow for that, the trade, as the UK's trade cost goes up, Ireland exports to the US is now going to be affected because it's going to have to pay higher trade costs to export to the US. So you see these increases in the negative impact, very much so for Ireland as well, and interestingly also for the Netherlands. And the reason for this is because the UK uses the Netherlands as an entrepôt to access other countries. And so as UK trades less as a result of its trade costs going up, this is also going to impact the goods that are going through the Netherlands as well. And so this is very much how we're thinking about, like if we perturbate a node in the network, right, that it's going to definitely have bilateral implications. And as a result, it's going to different countries are going to get hurt proportionally differently. I can show you this in terms of a world map. If this is the baseline, you'd see just the UK and Ireland being hurt. When we allow for scale and network effects, the lighter colors, so green and yellow is where I'll draw your eyes to, and the lighter blues are going to be the countries that are hurt even more. And these, unfortunately, are going to be the smaller countries that use the UK as an entrepot. So Iceland over here and Ireland are going to be the ones that are disproportionately hurt. And I'll answer your question a slightly different way too, which is that I'm going to look at whether or not the impacts of these welfare generation are kind of first counterfactual is localized or not. And so we have our impacted country. We're doing the changes in transport and tariff changes. And we're going to look at countries that are impacted. So here is the impacted distance on the x-axis from the targeted country. So left is going to be very close. Right is going to be very far away. So same thing on the right here. This is from tariff improvement. On the left is from transportation improvement. So of course, the further you are from the change country, the less you're going to be impacted. That's just gravity. However, if we split these countries into whether or not you're an entrepot or not, if the transport improvement happens at an entrepot, the further away you are still going to have that decline in distance, but the larger localized impact is going to be a lot higher. Okay, so transportation improvement at entrepôts are going to have a much larger localized impact versus tariff improvement at the entrepôts. And if we allow for scale, this is going to magnify this location effect, this localization effect even more.
Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah, one, can I ask just very quickly, could you flip this around in principle if, from a STEG perspective, if we're very focused on low-income economies, say in sub-Saharan Africa, could you answer the question, which entrepôts or where would the places be where a trade improvement or where a trade cost improvement would make the biggest difference for, let's say, Tanzania?
Right, I see what you're saying. So instead of doing this, where we say world economy, we rank it by which countries are going to have the biggest impact. Break it up by like either regions, like you said, or kind of low income countries, and try and figure out where's the highest bang for your buck if I want to improve an entrepot and improve transportation access. Yeah, thank you. That's super interesting. And we certainly have all of the tools to already calculate that.
Yeah, I think that'd be really interesting. I think it'd be neat to see, because my guess is it might not be obvious. It might be that depending on where, and that probably imports and exports flow through different hubs and entrepôts.
Yes,
So maybe
yes.
to think of both of those separately. Great stuff, though. Really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. This is cool. We can definitely.
So I had it somehow. You have 30 seconds, but I think this is to think about related to Doug's question. There is extreme. I could expect that there is extreme path dependence here, in the sense that Egypt happens to have one of the largest entrepôt because of the Suez Canal, and that's gonna shift the answer to the question that Doug has asked, because where you put the new entrepôt are going to depend on where the old entrepôts are, and I think it would be really nice to think about that path dependence.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's super cool. Like it's definitely very hard to think